Risk is why we're out here, Captain. One might even say it's our business?
Risk. Risk is our business.
It's business. It's business time. We're gonna be Captain Kirk and going. It's business. It's business. It's business time. I'm so sorry. If anyone got that reference, I appreciate you, though. Hello, interwebs! I hope you are all doing well, because I am here to review the latest episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 3, this time the first episode of the back half of the season, Episode 6, The Sehlat Who Ate Its Tail. And as per usual, I will give my generalized spoiler-free overview, spoiler-free thoughts up front, and get into spoilers in the back end. I have an interesting tension with this episode because I personally think that this is the strongest episode of the season by a hot mile. Last week's episode, I think I ended up liking a lot on the back of the genre it was doing, because I love eldritch horror shit. That is stuff that I adore the most, and when Star Trek does it, which that episode did, and did it rather well, I end up really enjoying it. But it was an episode that also had a lot of messy things, was structurally very weird, especially in its pacing towards the top of the episode, and was doing also a lot of the things that I've been very frustrated with this season for doing, namely the relationship stuff, and also just not really telling a tale with any depth or meaning beyond the surface level of it's just a fun, sci-fi story, which is not what I really come to Star Trek for. This episode, though, is, I think, structurally just absolutely nailing it. It feels like it's entirely focused. It doesn't have a lot of wishy-washy stuff. It tells its story, gets in, gets out, and it does it really well. And not only that, it does seem to have an undercurrent of social commentary going on underneath it, social and political commentary underneath it, that I ended up really enjoying when I look back at the episode and seeing what it was trying to do and what it was laying down. That being said, though, this episode feels like it is here to try to sell me on something that I desperately do not want. And while it makes a really strong case for that thing, I really end up don't wanting it. I'm beating around the bush here. This episode is very much doing a Star Trek Year 1 episode where we have Captain Kirk is the center character of this, and we have pretty much the entirety of Strange New Worlds' version of our TOS crew from the original series under his command dealing with a threat. And this episode very much is seemingly trying to set up and pitch to us that show that Akiva Goldsman has been trying to pitch publicly to just the fandom writ large, as well as to the new Star Trek owners Skydance, which is its whole other conversation, of his Star Trek Year 1 show, which would be basically rebooting the original series, have Captain Kirk in charge of the Enterprise and doing the first year of the 5-year mission, technically taking place just before the events of the original series, but effectively would just be a reboot of it. I'm going to be doing a video that I'm going to be recording right after this, but will probably come out tomorrow or later this week, going into more depth about why I desperately do not want that show. But to give a shortened version of it, why would we want that show? Not in a why would you redo the original series? It's, sacred and perfect, but more so why are we doing a show that would just be redoing the thing that we already have? Star Trek, for a very long time now, has been mired in this prequel setting. And while we have gotten ways of escaping that here and there, Star Trek Discovery Season 3 onwards, there has been an over-focus on nostalgia or bringing back legacy characters. Pretty much every Star Trek show has had some level of focus on that. I think Prodigy arguably is the one that kind of broke the mold the most on that, and even that had a Captain Janeway at the helm. But Year 1 just desperately feels like it's it's just going to be literally redoing the same show. At least something like Strange New Worlds has had this little bit of it's similar to the original series, but we have new characters, new things like that. And on top of that, this season has been feeling like it's been redoing a lot of the original series stories. I think most overtly the second episode of the season with Trelane, but doing so in a way that kind of removes some of the interesting depth to it and just does traditional stories, not just in a sci-fi sense, but in a, look at the guy's trying to get over the girl with Spock, having to go through this marriage sort of dealio. That just, I'm like, what are we even doing here? It just feels like you're just playing in nostalgia and not really trying to say anything new, and in fact just relying on tropes that are outdated at best and offensive at worst at this day and age, such as the Trelane is the flamboyant wedding planner. So ultimately, I'll go into more depth on it later, but I really don't want that show, especially from, frankly, if this is the mindset they go into that show with, I don't really want that show from this team. And again, I say that as someone who has liked a lot of these writers, knows some of these writers, and has liked their work, but I just don't think that they have the mindset of getting away from the, like, let's play with our favorite action figures mode for the most part. And this episode feels very much like it was Akiva Goldsman trying to sell that pitch. There's probably not a coincidence that he has been so vocal about his year one pitch, not just because of the Skydance merger, but also because he knew this episode was coming out and it would be the one that would probably try to sell to the fandom most, that year one idea. And I will give credit where credit is due. This episode does a decent job of selling that concept. This episode's focus on Kirk, I actually really ended up enjoying because it gives us a Kirk in a different place in his career. It is not just doing, oh, look, we're going to have fun and play with our action figures. No, Kirk has an actual journey here, which feels like it's somewhat different than the rest of this season, which has been just kind of wanting to redo TOS. And so I at least appreciated that they're going to play with their Kirk. They are doing something slightly different with him overall. And not only that, this episode, like I said, had stuff that it wanted to say. My only big knock on it, and I'll get into this more in spoilers, is that a lot of that interesting commentary comes with a reveal that happens at the end of the episode. And that reveal, backfills a lot of interesting commentary on the episode in a really intriguing way, but I almost wish that had been forefronted even more to give us more depth beyond the Kirk arc that we get here. Because, yeah, it makes like a rewatch of this have slightly more depth, but not a ton more. And I'm like, the ideas that you have here are actually really fascinating and feel very original series, but in a way that feels like it could speak to our contemporary issues going on right now. And I almost wish you had been more forefront with them. Not to have Kirk, give a huge speech about greed and consumerism necessarily, but let us sit with those ideas and explore those ideas a little bit more rather than just sort of popping them up at the end of the episode in an admittedly very intriguing way, but ultimately in a way that, feels like, we didn't get enough depth with it. There is some stuff here with the rest of our non-TOS character crew, but it's mostly there for some campy fun and some action beats that I ultimately found, enjoyable. There's a certain camp element that I know some people will probably end up really disliking, but, you know me, I always like the weird campy choice. I was kind of here for it. It worked for me. But really the focus here is on the Captain Kirk and getting to play around the TOS crew. And I think for the most part, it actually really works. I just wish it had a little bit more depth, and I just have a strange tension with it. That's not necessarily this episode's fault, but it is sort of trying to sell me on an idea that, it did a great job here to do, but ultimately I'm still very pessimistic about in the grand scheme of looking at this season of Strange New Worlds and looking at the state of sci-fi and media in general and Star Trek media in general in our current, post-capitalist tech oligarch age that we're in right now. So, I have that interesting tension with this. One other thing I will mention, I'll get more into this in the specifics, the actual weird MVP of this episode is not Paul Wesley as Kirk, though he did do a great job. It was actually Martin Quinn's Scotty, who did a fantastic job this episode. I'll talk about more why in spoilers, but he was easily the MVP of this episode, and honestly just selling me really on his version of the character a ton. I am just really surprised by how much I've ended up really enjoying Martin Quinn's Scotty, mostly considering Scotty's never been a character that I particularly loved. Many other people have, but he's just not one that I've resonated with. But Martin Quinn has been really making me love the character a lot more than I ever have before, so credit to him for that.
Hello, computer.
But all that being said, let us get into actual spoiler discussion here. So if you have not seen the episode, shoot off your nacelles and get on out of here. That makes sense, right? You know what I'm saying. You get out of here. You go. We're going to talk some spoilers. I don't know why I babied you there. Anyways, let's talk about the episode. The opening of this episode was rather interesting to me because we get, Kirk on the Farragut, and he's clearly got this smug attitude going on of like, I think I would make the better decisions of captain. By the way, I will say his Vulcan captain's hair, loved her hair. We've had some weird hair stuff going on this season with Una's hair in, I think, episode 2 or 3, and Celia Rose Gooding's wig in episode 1 of this season. So it was nice to see someone actually having good hair. I loved the Vulcan hair here. And we get some allusions here to Kirk clearly, wanting command and the sort of forward thinking of like Kirk's eventually getting the captain's chair. He even says like, risk is why we're out here, clearly alluding to the risk is our business speech, the famous speech that Captain Kirk gave.
Risk is our business. That's what the starship is all about. That's why we're aboard her.
Beginning the actual plot here, when the planet blew up, my initial thought, especially since we didn't see the ship at first glance that Kirk was talking about when he looked at the screen, was, oh my God, are we doing the Doomsday Machine from the original series? And I was fully just kind of like, what are we doing here? Because, and this is just the cynicism that this season has kind of been giving me. Are we just going to keep redoing original series plot lines? Thankfully, that is not the case here. Weirdly enough, and I don't think this is intentional, and it takes in a different direction, so this is not me saying, they're copying or stealing or anything like that, but it was just kind of funny to see the similarities for me. The plot of this episode is actually very similar to Star Trek Lower Decks Season 1's finale. If you have not seen that show, that season finale of that show features the Pakleds having scavenger ships, stealing from Starfleet ships, and like literally ripping their nacelles off, putting them into their own little clump ships by putting their technology on top of them. And the MO of the ship here in this episode is very much doing the exact same thing as that, to the point where we have this whole mystery about what these aliens are that are controlling the ship. I literally thought when we were going to take off the mask, I'm like, are they going to do the Pakleds? Thankfully, they did not. Took it in a different direction, but I was literally like, throughout my first watch of this episode, I was like, are they doing the Pakleds? Is that what this is building towards, Lower Decks crossover again? But again, this episode takes it in a wildly different direction than the Lower Decks episode, despite these surface level similarities. So, Star Trek there's many episodes across Star Trek's run that have very similar vibes, but ultimately take things in different directions. So I think that's ultimately okay. It just made me laugh. But at the end of the day, as I said in the spoiler-free section, all of this was just an excuse, essentially, to get Kirk into the captain's chair, and our TOS crew, like Spock, Uhura, Chapel, and Scotty, I believe that's all of them. Lon comes over, but she jumps back over the Enterprise as well at a certain point. We get a couple eye looks between her and Kirk because we know they have a romantic history, which I'm glad they did not lean into this episode. I don't need more jealousy stuff between Kirk and Spock and Lon. I don't need that love triangle extrapolated on even further, so thankfully it was just left to glances. But ultimately, we're getting set up here to have Kirk in charge of essentially the TOS crew from the original series, sans a few key members like McCoy. And again, I like that it is Kirk in this place of, as he says later, he was the dog who who caught the car, because, he's been wanting to get command, doesn't know what to do with it now because he's sort of thrust into this position. And I really liked seeing him develop his command style, because to me, what I always liked about Captain Kirk as a captain, he was never my captain. My captains are, I love Burnham, Janeway, Sisko. Those are kind of my captains. I think Kirk is on the lower end of my love of captains. But what I see in Kirk, and what I think a lot of people do resonate with him for, is he is a captain who, is very decisive. He is someone who will, take action and will, make the bold choice even when it could be very, very risky. Again, risk is our business. But that takes a lot of confidence in self. And, sometimes I think people misunderstand that version of Kirk because, a lot of people say, like, he's the authoritarian, he makes his decisions, he's in command, he's coming up with all these ideas himself. It's like, no, he's the guy who will listen to Spock, who will listen to, Scotty, he will get their advice and he'll solicit information, but he will be the one to synthesize it and make a decision, which is somewhat different than Burnham, for example, or even Pike, as we've been kind of seeing this season, though I think Pike is a little bit bit more wishy-washy than Burnham. That's a conversation for another day. I'm sure I'll get comments from that, from saying that, but that's a discussion for another day. But what I like about Burnham is she is less the like dictatorial captain and more like let's create a conversation. We're all kind of more on equal footing, a more anarchistic, everyone's sort of flat power structure to a degree. And, she's the one that makes the ultimate decisions, but she opens up those discussions. Kirk much more solicits advice rather than having the open discussion, and will synthesize and make decisions based on the advice and the information that he's getting here. But that works because, as Uhura says at one point in this episode, he sees something in me and makes you want to be the best version of yourself, so he trusts that the advice he's getting is from the experts. So that's what I really like about Kirk as a character. And that requires, like I said, a lot of confidence that this Kirk no longer has, especially since he's been shaken about the fact that he could have gotten his crew killed by, being like, risk is our business, let's go down to the planet, without really thinking it through. It is this sort of like bravado without, thinking about it necessarily. Like, I think more of it as a breadth of history to draw upon, an experience to draw upon to make those decisions. And since he's more inexperienced, he doesn't have that breadth of experience. And I liked seeing that come out here to the point where like he's, trying to give command, trying to seem confident, and making choices that cause Martin Quinn's Scotty to question things. And I love how Martin Quinn plays this episode kind of pissed off as we go further and further into this, in the sense that like he understands, like I love that one moment, it's like, you got a raw deal. No one can say that, but like there might not be something that we can do here. And Kirk being unwilling to accept that no-win scenario frustrates Scotty, being like, man, you have to live with reality, and getting kind of pissed off at Kirk and his wishy-washiness mixed with his inability to accept that he might lose. I just like seeing that as an arc for Scotty as a character in this episode, and Martin Quinn just played it so damn well that I ultimately really ended up loving it. But it all leads to a scene where, everyone's starting to question Kirk's command, and Spock goes in to talk to him. This scene needed to really land because Kirk and Spock are the two pairing of Star Trek. Their dynamic is what made that show and this franchise take off. Spock by himself, but definitely the two of them together were certainly the standouts of the show. So this scene needed to land, and for me, it does. But I will say Paul Wesley and Spock and Ethan Peck don't necessarily fully have that chemistry yet. But we get elements of it, like the joke at the end there.
I still feel funny being called that while Varel's alive.
I promise to demote you at the earliest opportunity.
So there's elements of it, and in some ways that kind of plays to the benefit of the prequelness of this all, right? In the sense that it is them before. They are those iconic, friends. So it kind of plays to their benefit, but it is one of those things where you watch it and you're like, man, I miss that dynamic, and this isn't entirely giving it to me, so you're a little bit disappointed in it. But I did like the conversation, the open conversation that they have with, Kirk saying, like, I'm like the dog who tried to catch the car, and Spock being like the Sehlat who caught it stale, very similar metaphor. I like that sort of cross-cultural discussion there. That felt very Star Trek to me. And Kirk being grounded by a less emotional character. Because again, the great balance between Kirk and Spock was this sort of more, take charge energy, and the more intellectual, reserved Spock was such a great push and pull. Some things, though, that didn't work in the scene for me, there was this moment, and it kind of speaks to my larger issue with the whole season, is there's this moment where Spock says something like, if you don't go out and talk to them, it will be not good. There's like a pause, and he says not good.
Your crew is waiting. To keep them waiting longer would be not good.
And that is clearly meant to be a joke for us as the audience, because we expect Spock to say that would not be logical. But then the episode says not good instead, and it draws attention to the fact that he's saying not good instead of logical. And it makes the sentence structure really weird in a way that makes me be like, Spock would never say that. And as a result, it draws attention to the fact that that is a meta joke that is not there for the characters. Spock wouldn't care about repeating the word logical or not. It is there for us as the audience being like, he didn't say logical, he said something different. And it's this sort of meta humor that takes me out of the show. And again, it speaks to a larger problem that I have with this whole season, less pronounced here to a degree, but it is this fact that this season is so much relying on meta-knowledge of past Star Treks for its meaning, rather than imbuing this season with meaning on its own terms and adding more to Star Trek. I made this comparison before, but, Star Wars Andor is a show that I really, really love. Not the only reason, but one of the major reasons that show works so well is that it is pulling from not just Star Wars, it is pulling from history. It is pulling from histories of fascism, colonialism, imperialism, specific moments in history like the French resistance to the Nazis. And then it uses a Star Wars aesthetic to play with those concepts and ideas. It is pulling from outside of itself to give itself more meaning in the moment. Star Trek The Original Series did that a lot too. A lot of Star Trek The Original Series episodes were pulling directly from Cold War issues that were going on at the time, or socio-political issues that were going on at the time.
Do you remember the 20th century brush wars on the Asian continent? Two giant powers involved, much like the Klingons and ourselves. Neither side felt that they could pull out.
Yes, I remember. It went on bloody year after bloody year.
It was trying to pull from specific moments in history, either contemporary or in the past, to imbue what it was doing now with meaning through a science fiction lens. And, putting its own Star Trek spin on it, of like having empathy for the other in a way that, the more jingoistic, rah-rah space science fiction of like Forbidden Planet and stuff like that at the time was not doing, with it being much more militaristic in a way that Star Trek was not being, but still taking from historical moments to have those conversations and talking about like proxy wars, stuff like that. And a lot of Star Trek has done that. The best Star Trek, to me, has done that. This season of Star Trek, though, is doing a Rise of Skywalker, just referencing more Star Trek, without necessarily looking at what those things and what those symbols mean beyond just the surface level of like, hey, this is a cool sci-fi thing that I love, whether it be Star Trek or other franchises. And as a result, it becomes very insular and not building up meaning on its own. I think the best example of this that I can give is that speech that I talked about in a few episodes ago, the holodeck episode, where the holodeck version of Celia Rose Gooding's character gives the speech about the importance of Star Trek, right? It's about the in-universe holodeck show, but she's giving the speech about like it'll inspire kids in space and da-da-da-da-da.
TK wanted Frontier to take our rotten world with its warts and injustices and give audiences something better.
And all of that with weekly space adventures?
You don't find the idea inspiring? You don't think some kid out there is going to see this show and spend the rest of their life searching the stars?
But the show in the episode that we have seen that is part of the holodeck program doesn't tell me that. Like, if I watched that show, the version of that show as a kid, I would have been like, this is just a dumb, silly sci-fi show. But, like, the original series was not that. It had that. But then it would do more. And that episode of Strange New Worlds did not show me that within its episode, but was able to have this speech from Uhura about the importance of Star Trek because we as the audience know Star Trek. We know that its importance to history. And as a result, it's like relying on metatextual awareness to give meaning rather than imbuing its own episode with meaning. We see that same thing happen here with these jokes of like Spock saying, not good, instead of logical, because it's a joke for us as the audience. But imagine you're someone who's never seen the original series coming into this show. It has no meaning to you. You're like, why would he say that? That was just a weird bit. And in fact, I will say, like, where it works in this episode is, with Kirk having his own arc this episode that is not overly reliant on us knowing his trajectory. Yes, it is helped by that of like him, we know his trajectory to get to the captain's chair. And we get these lines like risk is what we're here, like the risk is our business line. Like it's clearly alluding to those stuffs, but there is an arc within this episode that like works on its own terms for Kirk based on what we have seen through his arc through Strange New Worlds, rather than inherently relying on where we end up knowing he's going to go. That's why I end up liking this Kirk story, but why I'm hesitant of getting more with year one, and because of what the rest of the season has shown me. So, take that for what you will. That is that interesting tension going on within the episode here for me, that Spock moment is just a small example of signaling for the rest of the season, like metatextual pulls without meaning. Ultimately, though, we get into the whole, Kirk rallies, helps get the crew to see the best in themselves and then comes up with a good scenario to try to save the ship. And I really liked it. It was kind of fun throwing the nacelles onto this giant clump ship. I've kind of avoided talking about the stuff going on the Enterprise. Yeah, there's not much to say there. It's a lot of little action. I mean, it's all mainly there to build up this whole, like, why didn't they kill Captain Pike mystery? Who are these aliens mystery? They kind of look like the Vogons from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the design of their outfits for a little bit for me. Again, leading to, like, are they Pakleds? That I was expecting but did not thankfully get. But the only other thing that happened with that as well is the getting the ship out of there with Ortegas flying the ship, because Ortegas flies the ship, and Pelia helping them by using old telephones, like the hardwired telephones. Felt very Battlestar Galactica. I know, and I was recently on a podcast last night, and I know Christopher on that podcast really hated the telephones, because it was too camp, and there's that, like, personal massager, like, haha, do you masturbate with this joke that Ortegas has. I end up liking that sort of stuff. Like, it's weird, silly camp stuff that I always enjoy. I know it can throw some people out if you're not a fan of camp. I'm queer. I'm here for weird, silly nonsense. I'm always down for it, and I like it. The one thing that I didn't really love was when Una vents the airlock to help straighten out the Enterprise. Because I'm like, really? One vent of an airlock would have enough push to, like, turn the Enterprise that fast? Like, it would, obviously, if they're in space, would cause some level of turn to the Enterprise, but to do it that much that quickly, and it felt like it was too much energy for the push out of the air that the airlock was giving. And also, it should have also kept the Enterprise rotating. Like, why did it, like, it pushes the Enterprise to, like, level out, but in space it would technically have kept turning. Just the physics of that. Like, I get they wanted an extra little thing for Una to do, but for me, the physics of it read weird to me, and it threw me out of the whole thing. So all of that was just sort of like, it was fine. It's not super in-depth, and certainly not the meat of the episode. But it all leads to the end reveal of the episode, where we learn that the aliens on this ship were human. Not only that, they were humans that tried to escape Earth during the climate crisis going on essentially today. There's one thing I don't really love about it, but overall, though, I really liked this concept, because it finally does what I've been wanting Star Trek and Strange New Worlds to do this whole damn freaking season, which is have social commentary. And what this does is it does two things, the most obvious of which occurs when we get that zoom in on the American flag, and we juxtapose that with Captain Kirk talking about how these people have an unending greed and just want to consume for consuming's sake.
We'll never have enough.
Exactly. Scotty, you just found their weakness. Their ravenous need to consume. Bottomless greed.
And tying it into humanity today, or close to, with the American flag, is literally the show being like, look, we humans in our capitalist society, especially in America right now, are incentivizing this consumer society of endless consumption for consumption's sake. We don't even know why we're consuming. We're just consuming. And again, this is one of those things where, like, I like that as an idea, but I wish we had gotten more of it. I wish we had brought that up a little bit earlier and revealed that a little bit earlier, because there's so much more commentary you could have on that, right? Rather than just, like, consuming for consuming's sake and, hey, we as humans do it now. Because there's this whole thing about why, like the systems that incentivize that, the colonization things, like extracting resources, the systems that incentivize greed. Like there's a whole lot more you could do with that idea and delve into that idea. It's a nice idea, and it has some social commentary and adds in this nice layer of, look at where we are today, look at the humans of Star Trek and how they're different from that. They don't have this endless need for consuming. So I like that, but it's just like, oh man, I wish you had brought that up even more earlier. Because if you look at the original series, that would generally be what the original series would do, right? We would visit a planet, and it would have an interesting socio-economic, political problem that was reminiscent of something today, some aspect of today, and we would commentate on it. We would explore the idea. Here, we're just getting it kind of tossed out at the end. And it's like, okay, I appreciate the commentary, but I wish there had been a little bit more in there. It does allow for another thing, though, which I also really like, save for a couple little hiccups, which is it has this whole conversation at the end with Kirk being like, oh, I didn't have empathy for them. I didn't see them as human. And Pike having this reminder of, like, our enemy is not always so different from us. Empathy is a choice. We have to give it or not, and remember that our enemy is not always that different from us. That feels so very Star Trek to me. It is a very, like, we should see the other as ourselves, whether they are our enemy or not, because Star Trek is always very much about having empathy for the other, having empathy for those who are different from us, not going in with the militaristic let's fight, but saying how can we find common ground and resolve our conflicts that way, by finding common ground between our difference. And if, we can't, or if you're being aggressive, if you're being fascist, we'll punch you in the fucking face, but trying to find that understanding and trying to have that empathy in the face of all of that. And so I really liked that as a message. And I'm hoping, here's where one of my quibbles comes from, it's weird for me that it comes from Pike. Because Pike has been the guy who's like, the Gorn are just monsters this whole season.
Well, I've seen them up close and personal, and they're not hard to understand, Bob. They're monsters.
Monsters are a word to describe those who don't understand us.
And sometimes a monster's just a monster.
So while he has had little signs, like talking to Battelle throughout the season about, like, I wish we could understand them and find common ground, the overriding message of Pike has been, like, I just see them as monsters. That being said, I could see the show setting up that as an arc for Pike, of like Pike telling Kirk this, but him needing to learn it himself, especially as we get the allusion earlier in the episode with Lon saying, oh, these people were considered monsters even by the Gorn.
No one has ever seen them, but I know they were considered monsters, even by the Gorn.
Turns out, hey, they're just like us. They're humans. So if the Gorn sees these people as monsters, how can they see maybe the Enterprise crew? Maybe they see us just as much as monsters as well. So it's seeming like it's setting that up as an arc. And if I go that direction, I will ultimately really, really like that. So I'm just flagging it as if they don't deal with it, it's a problem. If not, it can be an interesting arc. The other element, though, that I balk at a little bit, and I get what the episode was doing, but there's just something that irks me, especially about Kirk's response to it a little bit, that the episode puts forth, which is that we specifically feel bad for the death of these 70,000 crew members because they are human and they look like us. And Kirk even has that line where he says,
They were human beings. Why does that make it feel so much worse?
I get that the episode is trying to do the, hey, look, they were humans, oh, we should have empathy for them. And that, like, having this sort of realization of, like, oh, our enemy was not so different. They could become, like, we could become like that, and also, like, we should have empathy for them because, they look like us. And while I'm fine with the show doing that for the audience, us watching, being like, hey, you as the audience may not have had empathy for these people, but it is weird to me to have someone like Kirk, who comes from the Federation, who is interacted with numerous alien beings, presumably, and comes from this future where, the Federation is this coalition of multiple different alien species, for him to say something along the lines of, oh man, if they were just some random aliens, I wouldn't have felt bad, but, they're human, so I'm really wrestling with it. You know what I mean? It reads a little bit in-universe un-Star Trek-like in a way that makes me kind of not like Kirk a little bit, in having Kirk, who's this guy who lives in this multicultural alien society, be like, man, I only really care because they kind of look like me. I get what the episode's going for, and I appreciate that message, and it's a message that I think is really strong and really works, but I feel like you could have massaged the scene a little bit to help that land where it's like metatextually us as the audience are sort of saying like, oh, they're humans, oh, I should have not seen them as monsters, whereas the characters aren't necessarily expressing that. They sort of express more like, man, I would have felt bad either way for killing that many people, but like the fact that they're human, it sort of makes me question, like, could we have become that way? You know what I'm saying? Like, I think there was a little bit way to thread that needle a slightly bit better than it ultimately did. But I think that is ultimately everything that I have to say about this episode. Like I said, I think this is the strongest episode of the season. Unfortunately, that's not saying a ton, and even this episode didn't blow me away. We haven't had one of those episodes yet this season, so this episode's good, but ultimately it's not phenomenal, but I do think it is the best of the season. And then on top of that, there is this interesting tension that it is trying to sell me on a show that I am just very pessimistic about generally, the Star Trek Year One show. Even if it was a show like this, which was, doing something slightly different with Kirk, it's just a show that I think, like, we should avoid. Star Trek should avoid just redoing old shows with a slightly different spin on it. Like, let's do something different. Let's do something new. I'll have a video out tomorrow talking about not only Year One, but also the recently discussed Star Trek United pitch from Mike Sussman, which bringing back my boy Scotty Batts. If you want to hear my thoughts on, more in-depth thoughts on all of that stuff. So that'll be out tomorrow. But beyond that, that's my thoughts for this episode. What do you think of it? I'd love to hear all your thoughts down below. But beyond that, I hope you, my friends, live long and it's business. It's business time. We're gonna be Captain Kirk and going. It's business. It's business. It's business time. I'm so sorry.